Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, swagmen and swagettes. I'm your host, Joe Walker, and this is the Jolly Swagman Podcast. Welcome back to the show. This is an episode designed to warm your heart amidst all the talk of secular stagnation and deranged presidents. I'm not going to speak for very long, but let me tell you about our guest. Our guest is an absolute legend in my books, Nicholas Christakis, a very sweet man, a very smart man. He's an intellectual rock star who's taught at the universities of Chicago, Harvard, and since 2013, Yale. He's the Sterling Professor of Social and Natural Science at Yale, Sterling being the highest academic rank available, and he directs the Human Nature Lab. In 2009, Nicholas was named to Time magazine's list of the 100 most influential people in the world, and he has an interesting bifurcated background. On the one hand, he studied medicine at Harvard Medical School and was a hospice physician at the University of Chicago from 1995 to 2001. But on the other hand, he's also a successful academic who received his PhD in sociology from the University of Pennsylvania. He's a world expert in network science, and I'd recommend his 2010 TED Talk for a good summary of his work on social networks. Now, in 2009, Nicholas's research group extended their study of social networks to genetics, and 10 years later, after a decade of research, he's published his findings in a brilliant book titled Blueprint: The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. You may also remember Nicholas from the Halloween protests at Yale in 2015, if you heard about that in the news or on the internet, and I discussed that event in the introduction to my episode with Jonathan Haidt, which I released at the end of 2018. To bring you up to speed, Nicholas and his wife Erica were head and associate head respectively at Silliman College, a residential college at Yale. On October 29, 2015, Erica wrote an email to Yale undergraduates on the role of free expression in universities, in which she argued that students might wish to consider whether administrators should provide guidance on their Halloween costumes or whether they should be allowed to dress themselves. Nicholas had the temerity to defend his wife's outrageous email. I'm being ironic here, of course, and the episode culminated in students calling for them both to resign, protesting, and 150 students surrounding Nicholas in a quad for 2 hours, berating him and screaming at him. You can see the videos of that on YouTube. Ultimately, Erica and Nicholas resigned their positions, and Nicholas went on sabbatical. The event was decried as a triumph of madness over free speech and an example of the social justice left eating its own. But that was 4 years ago now. And Nicholas is back and back with a message. He's here to tell us not only that the bright side of human nature has been denied the attention it deserves, but that our proclivities to cooperation, friendship, and love are as evolutionarily ingrained as our instincts to eating food or breathing air. Without much further ado, please enjoy this delightful chat with Nicholas Christakis. Nicholas Christakis, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So good to speak with you. I'm not sure if you remember, but I did send you an email at the end of last year commiserating with the Yale events of 2015.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I just interviewed John Haidt on the podcast, and we were speaking about the psychology of mobs, especially now in the elite liberal university context. And I went out and did some research in preparation for that, and I looked at the protests at Claremont McKenna College in California, as well as what happened with you and your wife, Erica. And I was so moved that I had to send an email.
You're catching me flat-footed. I don't remember that particular email, but I'm tempted to look it up now. Did I respond? I hope I responded.
You did, yeah, you were very nice. You sent me a bunch of information. But, yeah, I mean, for people interested in that event, I kind of speak about it. I tell the story in the introduction to my conversation with John Haidt, and I think John and I also do a pretty good job of discussing the psychology of such events. So it's not something I want to go into today, but it's certainly great to meet the man himself and talk about your fantastic new book, Blueprint. Let me begin by asking you this. Tell us the story of the time your mother took you and your brother to a protest in Greece in 1974.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You know, I have sort of oddly, for a man who spent his life studying the origins and functions of human social groups, I've never very much liked crowds, and I've had mostly unpleasant experiences in crowds in my life, and some of which you alluded to at the opening here just now. But that wasn't the first or even worst experience I've had in crowds. And so in the book, I tell the story of when I was 12, in 1974, my mother, who was a very progressive person, a woman who really was invested in how we were raised and very invested in us seeing the world. And she was Greek. She and my father had immigrated to the United States, and we were born in the United States, but then had returned to Greece. Greek was my first language. Then we came back to the States when I was 6 in 1968. And so the late 60s and early 70s, which were a time of great ferment in our society, we lived in Washington, D.C. My mother used to take us to civil rights marches. She actually eventually died. My mother died when I was 25 and she was 47. But in 1974, we go to Greece for the summer, and the military dictatorship had come to power in Greece in 1968. In approximately 1968, and in 1974 or 67 rather, and in 67 it come to power. And in 1974, 7 years later, the dictatorship is collapsing, just by chance while we're there that summer. And the junta sends armed sort of men into the streets, many of them in big trucks, and others sort of marching through the streets. And they're holding megaphones, and they say, you know, people of Athens, this doesn't concern you. Stay inside. And my mother, of course, would have none of that. And so she took me and my younger brother, so we were like 10 and 12 years old, and she goes out into the streets, which are filling with people, citizens that are ecstatic that the junta is about to fail. And we're all walking to Constitution Square, Syntagma Square, in the middle of Athens. And we get about a block or two away from Syntagma Square where it's just packed. There's body to sweaty body. You can't move at all. And we're right outside the Greek zoo, the National Zoo, to this big stone wall with this wrought iron fence on top of the stone wall. And my mother boosts us up onto this little bit of ledge that's on top of the wall in front of the wrought iron. And my brother and I are standing there with our backs to the iron, kind of holding on, and people are yelling and screaming, you know, "Exo gli Americani," which means out with the Americans, and "Essa esse vasaniste," which is a cry about the prison, the kind of torturing prison that they had, the junta had, and meaning down with the torturers. And I was very worried because I couldn't understand as a child why, if this was such a joyous event, everyone's seeming so angry, and people were yelling and screaming and looked agitated. And I was very worried that the crowd would shift and we would lose track of my mother, who was right behind us. We could see her right below us. And my mother was getting really caught up in this event. And when the cheers started going, you know, "Down with the Americans, down with the Americans," very suddenly and unexpectedly, my mother points up at me and my brother and says, "Nai Americani," there are the Americans, pointing at her two sons. And at the time, I think probably, there was this child killer, Medea, who killed her children that she had, I think, with Jason, because he betrayed her. Child killer Medea in ancient Greek mythology. I think that story flashed through my eyes, and I couldn't understand what my mother was doing. And actually, when I was writing the book, I really wanted to go ask her more details about this, but she's been dead many years, so I couldn't ask her. But what I've decided is that what my mother was attempting to do, knowing her commitments and knowing, what a remarkable person she was, I think what she was trying to do was to calm the ardor of the crowd by saying to them, not all Americans are bad. Some are just young boys like my sons, who are right here. Anyway, that's how I choose to interpret it. But the point of the story is to talk about how human beings, when we are part of groups, often surrender our individuality. And we have evolved to do this. We have evolved to de-individuate. And this ability to suspend our individual interests and participate in a group and make the will of the group the will of our own will, has actually been shaped by natural selection and is ordinarily a good property. Ordinarily, it's a property that allows us to do things we would not otherwise be able to do. So that's the story that I opened the book with, this overexpression of collective solidarity.
Wow. Now, do you think when you say that groupishness and the ability to be subsumed by the collective that seems to be triggered in certain moments in our civic life, do you think that evolved by individual level or gene level selection or group selection as well?
I think the evidence for group selection in humans is still limited, leaving aside cultural group selection, for which there's a lot of evidence, the way particular cultural traits could advantage certain groups, for example, which we can talk about later perhaps. But the evidence from multi-level selection, which I don't preclude, that is to say, I think there could be multi-level selection, but there's still limited evidence for it in human beings. No, I think that these traits evolved to serve to solve a number of evolutionary dilemmas. So, for example, if you imagine a very large group of people, and the challenge is how to get them to cooperate with each other. If there are too many people, it's very difficult for me to tell you each of you should go cooperate with everybody else. But if instead the rule is you're only going to cooperate with your own groups, we're going to cultivate in you the capacity to distinguish us versus them. And for everybody, you just cooperate with us, but not with them. This tool, this ability to distinguish us and them, reduces the sense of scale. It makes it so that each individual only has to cooperate with their own group. Everyone is cooperating with somebody, and groups form. So you get more cooperation out of this large group by dividing it into smaller groups than you would if you didn't divide it into smaller groups. So this groupishness, this tribalism that we have evolved to have, and is also a fundamental part of our human nature, for good and for ill, this groupishness serves a purpose, which is to facilitate our ability to cooperate. Incidentally, it's not the only tool we have evolved to make cooperation possible. For example, another tool we've evolved is the capacity to have friends. So this is very rare in the animal kingdom. We form long-term, non-reproductive unions with other members of our species. We have friends. Why? Why do we do that? With non-kin, with unrelated individuals. Well, this sustained presence of particular social connections is another way to reduce the sense of scale. So I tell you, you don't have to cooperate with all Australians, you just cooperate with your friends. And everyone has the same rule as cooperating with their friends. And as a result, all Australians are cooperating just with their friends. Whereas if you told them cooperate with everyone, it would be too much. So friendship is another way to, technically it's called adding structure to a population. It's a way to reduce the sense of scale of the population. And this is another tool that we have evolved to have. In fact, in the book I talk at length about, one of my general claims is that scientists for too long, in my view, and also the man on the street or the woman on the street, have paid too much attention to the dark side of our nature. We've been focused on our propensity to violence and hatred and mendacity and tribalism. But equally, we are prone to love and friendship and cooperation and teaching and all these other wonderful qualities. And in fact, I would argue that those qualities which bind our groups together, they're part of our human nature that allow us to function in groups, loving and teaching each other and cooperating and befriending each other and so forth. These qualities must necessarily have been stronger across evolution than the other qualities. Because look, if every time I came near you, you killed me, or you lied to me, gave me useless information, or you were mean to me in some way, I'd be better off not coming near you. So we would have evolved to be solitary animals if the benefits of a connected life must have outweighed the costs, and in fact did outweigh the costs. And so I'm able to explore some of the ways in which that happens.
Wow. There is so much about us as a species that is just beautiful and wonderful.
It is amazing.
But I mean, beautiful and wonderful according to what reference framework? I mean, according to the framework we've evolved. Unless you try to make some sort of moral, philosophical argument about why these evolved traits are so wonderful.
Well, I mean, I do argue that there's a very fundamental connection between our evolution and our morality, actually. Because if you think about it, most of our values, not all, but most of our values are social values. We don't care if you love yourself or are kind to yourself or are just to yourself. We care if you are kind, if you love others or are kind to others or are just to others. So there's a very deep connection between our sociality, the fact that we live in social groups and how we interact, and our moral commitments. And there's another whole debate about the origins of morality, but I do believe that many of the principles that we take as fundamentally moral principles, for instance, principles of reciprocity, actually have been shaped by natural selection.
Yeah, we can get into that too. So, Nicholas, let's just take a step back. Let me give you the opportunity to just outline generally how you came to the book, Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society, and what its core thesis is. You've kind of alluded to parts of it, but just give us an outline.
Well, I mean, I've been working on it for a long time, and and I think it's arriving at a kind of propitious moment in the world. I mean, there's increasing divisions around the world. There's a populism and nationalism, tribalism, a kind of us versus them mentality is very ascendant in many parts of the world. People are divided along all kinds of lines, linguistic lines, religious lines, ethno-racial lines, occupational lines, and so forth. We have extremely high levels of income inequality in the developed world. In the United States, it's the highest in 100 years. We're the gap between the rich and the poor. Our political divisions are very high. So it's sort of an odd moment, you would think, for a book like mine to appear, and yet at the same time, I think it's sort of a welcome moment, and my publisher feels that way at least, because it's sort of an optimistic book. It says fundamentally human beings are decent people. We're a kind species. We have evolved to be kind, and there's a very long, powerful force that is at work shaping our societies. And it's shaping them for good, shaping them to have these desirable properties that I alluded to. So that connects to the idea as well that we all, human beings everywhere, share a kind of common humanity. Because if you buy the argument that human beings, our behaviors in our societies have been shaped by natural selection, we're all human beings everywhere, and there's a sense in which you can conclude that we share these qualities universally. These are universal qualities. Everybody on the planet, anyone who's traveled anywhere or gone anywhere or had any meaningful experience in life knows that people everywhere love their partners and they love their friends. Have friends wherever you go around the world, and people cooperate with each other and they teach and they learn from each other. So despite the superficial differences between groups around the world, I would argue actually that there's much more that they share in common. And this universality, the universality of these traits, gives us a tool to through our common humanity, through our shared humanity, to bridge some of these divides, so that you can say, okay, well, these people over there, they wear different clothes than we do, and they speak a different language than we do, and maybe they have different tools that we do. But actually, the really important things, they're just like us, and this is true, actually. So I find that a rather optimistic thought, actually, a rather appealing thought. Now, I'm not naive. I'm not, like Dr. Pangloss in Candide. This is the best of all possible worlds. I recognize that every century is replete with horrors. I recognize that there can be venal and abusive leaders. I know that there's warfare and destruction. and hatred and violence. But I guess my argument would be is that despite all of that, the arc of our evolution is long, but it bends towards goodness. And this long arc of our evolution that bends towards goodness underlies a shorter arc of our history that bends towards goodness. So there's a whole set of arguments about how the technological advances and the philosophical advances that took place over the last 200 to 400 years have made the world richer and safer and healthier than it's ever been. And that's true. People may not recognize how privileged we are to live in the 21st century. There's more peace, more prosperity, and more health than there's ever been at any time in human history. And it's largely the product of modern technology and philosophical ideas about the equality of human beings and democratic governance and so forth. So all of those historical forces are in turn on top of the evolutionary forces that I was talking about. And I would argue that those historical forces, important though they are, actually are a fraction of the much more powerful forces, that we have been shaping us for hundreds of thousands of years. So we have these qualities that I call the social suite that we manifest: love, cooperation, friendship, teaching and learning, mild hierarchy. We as primates tend to we need some hierarchy. Total equality doesn't work for our groups, but we don't like too much. If someone gets to be too autocratic, we resent that. And in the book, I talk about shipwrecks and stranded, in fact, some in Australia, and stranded explorers, and what kind of groups fare well and how they fare based on whether they manifest some of these traits. So anyway, those are some of the theses. I guess I would say one more thing about the big theses, which is that the claim in the book is just like natural selection and our genes shape the structure and function of our bodies, which they do, and our genes also shape the structure and function of our minds, and hence our behaviors, which they do. Our genes also shape the structure and function of our societies. The kind of societies we humans make are very specific, and we have evolved to make them. And they're good, and they're universal.
Wow. So on that, tell me about the forbidden experiment.
Yeah, because if you're a crazy scientist like me, in your fantasy world, what you would do is you were saying, okay, what kind of society are human beings naturally going to make? And what you would like to do is take a group of babies that were acultural, had never been taught anything, and put them on an island by themselves, and somehow magically they raise themselves. And then you see, how do they organize themselves? Do they have love? Do they have cooperation? Do they have friendship, for instance? What kind of social order do they make for themselves? Now, obviously that's impossible. It's unethical and impossible. But it hasn't stopped people from thinking about it for a very long time. It's been called the forbidden experiment. And we have records going back at least to the Egyptian pharaohs. Herodotus writes about one pharaoh that was wondering what was the most primitive human language. And so he took two babies and gave them to a mute shepherd up in the mountains to raise, to see what kind of language did these babies speak if they weren't taught any language, like on their own. And other monarchs in Europe in the last 1,000 years have thought of this, allegedly have done this very cruel experiment of taking one or two people and isolating them. But of course, that's not even what we're talking about. We're talking about a larger group of people. So I knew this wasn't really possible. So instead, I thought, well, what are some natural experiments that might approximate this? And I review a bunch of such experiments. One is the history of shipwrecks in the age of exploration between 1500 and 1900. There were about 9,000 shipwrecks between 1500 and 9, many more ships lost, but 900 wrecked, some foundered at sea, but I'm talking about wrecks that hit the shore. And
sorry, where did you get that data?
There's a online website that we could look that lists for scuba divers all the known wrecks.
That's incredible.
And then we process that data to hone in on 20 cases of shipwrecks in which at least 19 people had been wrecked for at least 2 months. And then I got all of and we have a further requirement that at least one person survives to tell the tale. There are some amazing wrecks there where nobody survives. But anyway, so then I got all their journals of those individuals and looked also at modern excavations of their wreck sites and tried to get some insights into what kind of social order did this group of people who were thrown together make. And there's one wreck that's featured in the book that takes place in Tasmania. That is the wreck of the Sydney Cove in 1797, which wrecks in Tassie, and then the men then salvage one boat, and a crew of them then tries to sail back actually to Sydney, but wrecks again on the southern coast, southeastern coast of Australia, and then the men have to march 600 miles north to Sydney and have contact with the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, and it's quite an experience. They sound the alarm, and then they go back and rescue the people that were still stranded on Tassie. So, and there were quite a few wrecks in the Tasmanian Sea, actually, but only that one that I remember that was of the right size. Anyway, so you can actually look at those wrecks and see, what did these people do? And then there are other natural experiments of people who deliberately set out formed. So the shipwrecks would be unintentional communities, and then you can also look at intentional communities. So, for example, scientists that go and set up camps in Antarctica, the Shackleton expedition that was just stranded in Antarctica, communes, sort of communitarian movements that were very popular in the 19th century in the United States, kibbutzes in Israel, sort of hippie communes in the 60s and 70s, I'm sure in Australia as well. All kinds of communitarian movements that have taken place where people say, our society is screwed up. Let's go and make society again. And then you can go and see, well, what do they do when they're trying to make something new? Typically, they're unable to do anything different, and most of these experiments fail, which is also fascinating. And then I also look at online communities. So people, when in principle these massively multiplayer online games, people could interact with each other in principle in all kinds of ways, and yet here too they rather predictably reproduce certain core features of social interactions. So, and then I also review some experiments that we've done in my lab with 30,000 people. We have created some software that allows us to create temporary artificial societies of real people who spend about an hour in our laboratory, and we, in this godlike way, control their social interactions and then can test different ideas about how social order might affect them. So when I look at all of these data, and basically I come to the conclusion that actually only a very tiny fraction of all possible social orders that could, in theory, exist ever exists. It's very, humans are very predictable in these core regards. And then the question remains, what are those qualities and how to explain their origin? And then I spend time on that.
Given we can't run the forbidden experiment where we take, a bunch of babies and set them up on some isolated patch of land, how do you really control out all the confounding factors in the, the unintentional communities like the shipwrecks and the intentional communities like the communes? And how can you then really draw conclusions about our innate proclivities towards societies?
You can't. You can't. So that's where you have to use overlapping evidence. So you can do experiments. You can do experiments with briefer periods of time. So we've done those in my lab, many experiments with, as I said, with thousands of people, where we form them into groups and then test how well they work together, for example, or if we leave them alone, what kind of social networks do they form, for example. So you can do experiments like that, but the actual experiment you would in fantasy want to do is impossible. It's similar to asking me, what kind of body would human beings make if there was no food in the environment? you can't take people and starve them to death. You can maybe rely on natural famines that you didn't cause to look at what are the outcomes of famines, but it's not like you can actually do that experiment. So we have to rely on approximations.
Okay. So
but your question is the people who set out to start a commune, just for our listeners, the question is a good one. The question is, well, how do we know that the kinds of people that go to set up a commune are different kinds of people, more or less able to be friendly, for example?
Yeah.
And so maybe
selection bias.
Exactly. So we can't be sure about that. Now, the shipwrecks, nobody sets out to be shipwrecked, and so they didn't choose that, and they were just suddenly thrown by an exogenous force, right? Some kind of force majeure comes down and wrecks the boat, and then they're stranded on the island. Now, of course, even here, those people who are stranded were not a random draw of the human population in that epoch of exploration. Often they were mariners, or mostly they were men, for instance. And furthermore, they weren't acultural. I mean, they came from particular backgrounds. And they also sometimes had very rigid hierarchies, the crew and officers or the civilians and the mariners. But nevertheless, it's not a bad experiment, I think. It's instructive in some ways.
So, Nicholas, with all of these overlapping data, just hypothetically, say we did do the forbidden experiment.
Yes.
What kind of society do you think the babies would grow up to establish? What would it look like? What would its characteristics be?
It would be a society in which there was friendship. There were small cliques of people who hung out together. It would be a society that was mostly cooperative. People would quickly learn that if they work together, they can get more than if they are apart. I think people would have sex with each other, but I also think they would love their mates. This is uncommon in the animal kingdom. It's not hard to explain why we have sex with each other, but we also love each other. This predilection that we have is unnecessary, strictly speaking, for reproduction, and yet we've evolved the capacity to form a sentimental attachment to the people that we are having sex with. This is quite unusual in the animal kingdom. Obviously, we don't think other animals have love, but they are monogamous, for example, or they seem to become attached to the people that they are mated with. So I think our hypothetical society would do that. It would there would be some teaching. People are endowed with the capacity to learn from each other. This is also rare in the animal kingdom. It's not rare that animals learn. Even a little fish in the sea can learn that if it swims up to the light, it'll find food there. And certain other animals also learn socially, which is very efficient. So, for example, you put your hand in the fire and you burn your hand and you take it out. You've learned that fire burns, but you paid a price for that knowledge. Or I can watch you putting your hand in the fire. I get almost as much learning as you, but pay zero price. I mean, you burned your hand, not me. That's very efficient that I can watch you and learn socially, not independently. But we go a step further. We actually teach each other stuff. Like we teach each other how to make fire or how to heal wounds. And so this is a very rare property in the animal kingdom, this affirmative teaching. So my prediction in our forbidden experiment society is we would also find teaching. We would find as well, and this is a paradox, we would find as well the capacity for individuality. Now, it's sort of a paradox to say that individuality, the capacity for individuality, is actually essential for the capacity to live socially, but it is. So think about this. When you look out at a sea of faces, you can tell all the human beings apart because every human has a different face. This signaling of our individuality that we do with our faces is an evolutionary luxury. I mean, why don't we all have the same face? I mean, why don't we all look like cows or something? We all have the same exact face. We don't all have the same. Now, I know some people listening will say, I can tell my cows one from the other. That's not my point. My point is that we've evolved to be able to signal our uniqueness with our faces. And it's very expensive evolutionarily to be able to do that. The regions of the genome that make the shape of our faces, it would have been easier to have a sort of a standard human face rather than the variety. Furthermore, we don't just signal our individuality, we can detect it. Parts of our brain are devoted to the capacity of telling one person apart from another. This also is difficult in evolutionary luxury, and it's also rare in the animal kingdom. Why? Why do we have this capacity for individuality? Well, it's essential for our ability to live socially. You need to be able to tell your friends from your enemies. You need to be able to tell, this is the person who was kind to me before. I'd like to reciprocate the kindness. Who's my parent? How can I avoid people that wish me ill? You need to be able to distinguish one person from another. And so we have this capacity as well. So in our hypothetical society, in our forbidden experiment, the people would be able to do that too. They'd be able to distinguish among each other. So all of these traits would be present in this hypothetical society.
Got it.
And others.
So now we're just going to jump around to a few of these different traits, kind of like lily pads, and I'm going to ask you some questions about them. The first is love. Why did humans evolve the capacity to love their partners, their mates?
So there are a number of theories about this. One of the principal theories is that our loving our mates enhanced our reproductive capacity. That is to say, the fitness of our offspring is enhanced. Your children, if you're a man, do better if you stick around afterwards to help the woman who gave birth to them raise them. And the way you would stick around is if you have evolved a sentimental attachment to her. And conversely, she to you. Why does she evolve an attachment to you? Why does she signal that she loves you? One of the theories about this is that the love a woman feels for a man is a way of signaling that he is the father of their children. Otherwise, the man would not be invested in helping raise those children. So these theories, and there's some evidence for them, but these theories have to do with the fact that sharing parentage enhances reproductive fitness, and parents staying together for longer makes them better able to raise their young, and they're more likely to stay together if they have this sentimental attachment that we do.
Yeah. Some people may have noticed human babies are incredibly needy as far as the animal kingdom goes.
Yes. And they've evolved to be that way, actually, I think, us to feel that way about, that longing men and women have to like pick up little babies, and they smell so good to us, and they feel so good, and they need caring. All those feelings that we have are feelings we evolved to have, very natural feelings, and those also are quite rational from an evolutionary perspective.
Let me ask you now about social learning. This is particularly of interest to me. So just by way of background, I've been studying the Australian housing bubble intensively for the last year. I've been interested in the subject for longer than that. But so we have a world historic housing bubble, which is probably currently bursting at the moment. And bubbles are so interesting because they're as much about psychology and sociology and anthropology as they are about economics and finance.
Yes.
Robert Schiller describes them as social epidemics mediated by price movements. And one of the interesting things in bubbles is the way new investors are brought into the bubble by contagion and by this kind of mimetic desire or an envy of others' successes in a particular asset class. There are all these amazing economic studies that arose out of the US subprime mortgage crisis that, you're, whatever it is, 10 or 20% more likely to become a property investor if a property investor sells a house for a great price on your street, or people become property investors based on, people invest in, prices go up in totally geographically disconnected areas, almost in unison. And you can map that over people's social graph on Facebook. People talk to each other. Those human-to-human conversations are sort of the sinew of the bubble. And it's interesting how kind of at bottom that's based on this concept of social learning. We not only do we imitate each other, but we over-imitate each other.
Yes.
Can you talk to some of these ideas and how we develop them, how they make us special as a species? Because they're really, for a lot of things that happen in finance, it's quite key to understand these concepts.
Well, you used. There's a lot to unpack and say there, and I'm quite familiar with No, and I mean that Bob
Take
Schiller.
what you want out of that.
Yeah. Bob Schiller's a colleague of mine, and there's no doubt that these bubbles reflect social contagion, exactly as you describe. But I just want to pick up the thread that has to do with over-imitation, because we are not just an imitative species, but an over-imitative species. And at the first level, you could say, very famously, the social critic and longshoreman I think his first name was Tim Hoffer, said that when people are free to do as they wish, they generally copy each other, which is one of the deep ironies that whenever you could do whatever you wanted, I'll just do what everyone else is doing, which is kind of a kind of thing to do. So yes, we imitate each other, but as you alluded to, we also over-imitate each other. And there's been some fantastic experiments done with children and chimpanzees where this very elaborate, for example, a box that has to be manipulated in a very elaborate and specific way in order to get a treat out of the box. First you have to knock it on the side, and then you have to tap it on the top, and then you have to, blow on it, and then you do this, and then you open this drawer, and then you put your hand in, and there is a treat. And so humans, when they see another person do that, will copy every step exactly. And they'll do that even if the bottle is made out of lucite, so that you can see into the box. They'll do that even if the box is made out of lucite, so you can see into the box and see that many of the steps are useless. The step where you blow on it, for example, doesn't do anything, and the other step where you're tapping on the side doesn't have any effect on putting your hand into the drawer. And chimps won't. The chimp is able to just cut out all the crap and do the crucial steps that's needed to get the treat out of the box. So we humans have evolved not just to imitate each other, but to, in a very persnickety way, over-imitate each other. Like even useless steps, we copy each other and follow. Like our belief in magic. There are these specific things you need to do. When I was in medical school, I had a classmate who had been a house sitter for a Nobel laureate and decided that he was needed some luck to be a good medical student. And so he stole this Nobel laureate's underwear. And then he would always wear this underwear whenever he took exams. And he always did well. And he concluded that there was something magical about wearing, this is an over-imitative strategy, like ridiculous, putting on the Nobel laureates.
Some entrepreneurs used to wear Steve Jobs turtlenecks, for instance.
Yes, exactly. That's a kind of, if they actually thought, yes. So
not his actual turtlenecks, but turtlenecks like him.
To look like him, exactly. Sort of like some kind of magical thinking.
Yeah.
Anyway, so but fashions, one of the things that's amazing about human beings, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, is about the origin of arbitrary and essentially useless fashions. I don't mean clothing fashion so much. I mean other kinds of things that appear suddenly and spread. So everyone is playing Pokemon all of a sudden, or everyone is buying Beanie Babies, or even everyone is allergic to nuts all of a sudden. These are epidemics of social contagions, and we humans are very prone to them. Other social mammals do it too, incidentally, and I talk a little bit about some of those social epidemics in chimpanzees, for example, or in other social mammals in the book.
Our over-imitation kind of makes sense if you think about, so let me come at it this way. Another thing that's just so amazing about our species is how we've managed to conquer all of these disparate environments. If you think about Eskimos or Bedouins or Australian Indigenous peoples or people in the Amazon or people in Scotland, it's really incredible the way we've covered the earth. And, if you were migrating to a new area, your survival value would surely be increased by, in that new area, there would be new survival techniques, new hunting techniques.
Yes.
It would help you out a lot if you were able to mimic whatever the locals would do.
Yes.
Do you think that's not too much of a...
No. And I talk about that in the book. I talk about, the sort of lost European explorer files. I would die within days in Tanzania, in this area where we work with the Hadza people, where a Hadza teenager can survive indefinitely. And it's all to do, as you said, with culture, with our ability to transmit useful information across time and across space. So So we, the Inuit in the Arctic, they have fantastic technologies that they invented: kayaks and parkas and igloos and all of these technologies, which they transmitted across generation and which made it possible for them to occupy this environment. In fact, human beings, because of our capacity for culture, have manifested a kind of social conquest of the earth. We, as you said, we've spread out over the whole planet. We are, I think, the most geographically dispersed species on earth. We live in more different niches, and it's not because of our biology. It's not because of our genes that we do that. It's because of our genetically shaped capacity for culture, our genetically shaped capacity to teach and learn from each other. This is what makes it possible for us to live in all the places you mentioned. I think the settling of Australia is still a mystery. It's it's a very active area of investigation. So it's clear that the Aboriginal peoples came down through Indonesia and probably had very sophisticated ocean-going technology, which when they landed in Australia was very quickly lost within a few generations. So that by the recontact period, 20,000 years later, there was no seagoing technology to speak of. But there was a totally different set of technologies associated with living in the very challenging environment of the Australian outback. Deep understanding of animals, of poisons, of navigation, of how to get water, all of these things. So one whole toolkit was lost and another whole toolkit was invented that made it possible for these people to live in what is ordinarily a very inhospitable environment.
Mm. Now, speaking of these different toolkits that groups develop in response to new environments, tell us about the fascinating idea of gene culture coevolution.
Yeah, so gene culture coevolution. So the argument here is that human beings have two mechanisms of transmitting information across time: our genes, and we evolve slowly in response to changes in our environment, and our culture. So when you're born, you inherit all the culture that anyone has previously invented, and it's often freely available. So people 100 years ago built roads, and they figured out where to put the roads, and then the roads are still there. Or Isaac Newton invents calculus, and you get to learn calculus because Isaac Newton invented it. In fact, he was so smart that he invented calculus at the rate that you learned it. It took you a year to learn calculus, and that's how long it took him to invent the whole field, is a year. But now everyone if I took you now with what you learned in high school and transported you back 500 years, you'd be the most learned mathematician on the planet. So all this knowledge accumulates. It's available to all of us, and not just in the developed world. In the developing world, there's all kinds of indigenous knowledge that's transmitted about poisons, about plants, about navigation, about animal husbandry, and on and on and on. But the interesting thing about all of that culture is that culture then becomes a feature of our environment, which can then shape our evolution. And the most powerful and famous example of this is the evolution of lactase persistence in adults. So in our ancestral environment prior to 10,000 years ago, when we were born, we suckled at our mother's breasts, and we drank milk until we were weaned. And the primary sugar in milk is a sugar called lactose, and we needed an enzyme called lactase to digest that sugar, to extract the nutrient value of that sugar. Now, once we were weaned, we never drank milk again in our lives, ever, because there was no milk to drink. We weren't, as adults, suckling at the breasts of other people, nor were there any milk-producing animals that we were drinking the milk of. So there was no reason to have the capacity to digest lactose as an adult. Therefore, no reason to have lactase, the enzyme, as an adult. Therefore, proto-humans, not proto, but our ancestors prior to 10,000 years ago were almost all lactose intolerant. But then, multiple times, in multiple places, between 3,000 and 9,000 years ago, human beings domesticate animals. We domesticate cows or sheep or camels or goats, and those animals now produce milk. So now all of a sudden, there's milk in our environment. And those among us, those adults among us who by chance had a mutation that allowed us to drink and eat that milk, now suddenly had an advantage. We had a additional source of calories that we could use and a source of hydration in times when water was scarce or was spoiled. So those among us who then had this mutation could out-reproduce those that did not and expand in the population, with the outcome being that people who had lactase persistence into adulthood expanded and became more numerous, which is amazing. So the reason this is important is that it's a very powerful example of how something we humans do to change our environment, a technology we invent like domesticating animals, suddenly becomes a selection pressure in our environment. Now it's something just as powerful as the sunlight or the predators or prey or the microbes that we have to cope with in our environment, and it shapes our genetic trajectory. And it does so over historical time windows, like over the last few thousand years. And there are many examples of this, actually. That's the best example I just gave you, but there are others. For example, when we mastered fire, it's unclear when, probably about 1 million years ago, all of a sudden we could cook our food. And when you cook meat and plants, you make them more nutritious. You make them us better able to extract calories. They become a more energy efficient foodstuff. And you no longer need to chew them as much. And you no longer need it as an intestine that's as long to digest it as much. So our bodies change. When we master fire, we evolve to have different kinds of bodies. We evolve to have weaker facial muscles, so we don't have to chew as much, shorter intestines, and so forth and so on. Again, cultural invention, fire, making fire, controlling fire, reshapes our evolution. So those are a couple of examples of gene culture coevolution.
Yeah. And it's really amazing, as you say, how it can speed up our evolution. Because those timescales you're talking about in the
thousands of years, yeah.
Yeah, that example, thousands of years. Wow.
Well, I think our invention of cities in the last 5,000 to 8,000 years may have been making us smarter. I mean, all of a sudden we invent cities, which we never had before. Our species goes back about 300,000 years, although that date's also continues to be explored. We invent cities, and initially cities are actually worse to live in. For the first few hundred years, people who lived in cities fared worse, we think. But very quickly, cities became better, more surplus of food, more interesting life, more accumulation of technology. And so living in cities was better. And I think that being the people with certain kinds of brains that could live in cities were able to out-reproduce the people who could not. And actually, I think the invention of cities is making us, or did make us for a while at least, smarter. I'm not saying urban people are smarter than rural people. That's not what I'm saying. I'm talking about evolution now and about the demands of living in a city.
Huh. Are there any other ways you think we might be evolving at present?
I mean, think about it. It all depends on how powerful the force of selection is. So you may be aware that because of the disgusting decimation by human beings of elephants, these magnificent animals that we kill, and the populations of African elephants have declined by 90% in the last century, mostly for the ivory trade, but also for encroachment on human beings. Tuskless elephants are now evolving in Africa, literally in the last generation, because the elephants without tusks are not hunted by humans. There were always probably some mutations that resulted occasionally in an elephant being tuskless, but in the past this was a disadvantage because elephants use their tusks not only for defense, but also to dig up roots and other kinds of things. So, but now tuskless elephants are evolving literally in the last 50 years. So that's very rapid evolution under our eyes. I think it's possible some things like that could be happening in humans, but for those things to happen, they have to be equally lethal. Like the selection pressure has to be very powerful. And I think the living in cities example is a weaker force than, let me put it this way. If we shot you, if you didn't live in a city, very quickly everyone would evolve to like living in cities. But that's not what we're facing. We're not like the elephant tuskless example. But reading is a good example of this. We invent the printing press 400 years ago, and all of a sudden, in the last 200 or 300 years, we become a very print-rich environment. And there's no question that being able to read is a strong advantage in modern society. And the people who read are probably better able to raise kids than people who cannot read. And so it wouldn't surprise me if over, centuries long or millennium long time horizon, the invention of reading is something like the invention of domestication of cattle.
Yeah, because reading and writing don't come naturally to us. It's something you need to be taught and learn with great effort.
Well, what if people, if you think about it, the people among us who learn reading and writing more easily, they'll have an advantage. So slowly but surely, we may be selecting for that type of person.
Yeah.
So 1,000 years from now or 10,000 years from now, they may look at our brains and say, look at this part of the brain that's so well developed for reading and writing. Well, it wasn't always that way. It became that way.
Do you think we'll ever be able to uncover these fundamental laws of human nature to the same precision that we can, the fundamental laws of the universe?
I don't know the answer to that. Part of me wants to say yes, that we're just in a state of ignorance right now, and that, in 1,000 or 10,000 years, science will be sufficiently advanced that the social sciences will be on the similar footing as the physical and biological sciences. And part of me wants to say no. Part of me wants to say that the social phenomena have emergent properties that we don't have the tools to understand, just like we don't understand the origin of consciousness or the origins of life. Consciousness is an emergent property of neurons, and life is an emergent property of matter. It's astonishing. I can take carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur and oxygen and hydrogen and a little bit of iron and combine it in certain ways, and miraculously I get life. And there's no chemistry that could tell you this. There's no amount of chemical knowledge could forecast the properties of living systems. So the question is, will we ever be able to understand social processes the way we can understand certain other processes in the natural world? And I don't know the answer. I think yes and no. I think that we will be able to understand it much better, but there may always be some things that are still mysterious to us, things that have to do with how the whole comes to be greater than the sum of its parts. Yeah. This notion of emergence that we were talking about.
Finally, Nicholas, a couple of weekends ago, a right-of-centre Australian political party maintained government. They won the federal election.
Unexpectedly, yeah.
Unexpectedly. Many people have described this as our Trump or Brexit moment. What can left-of-centre parties, or what should the quote-unquote liberal elite take from your book? Is there anything they can learn that will help them win elections?
I don't know the answer to that. I will say that whether from the right or from the left, appeals to, it's always tempting for venal rulers to divide and conquer, to say, it's this group of people over there. They are responsible for your problems. The Roma are responsible, or homosexuals are responsible, or Mexicans are responsible, or the Jews are responsible, or, this is an old tactic to divide and conquer, and to tell the majority that some minority group is responsible for their predicament. And I think that type of behavior should be denounced by every right-thinking person, and should be seen for what it is, which is it's fascism in its incipient forms. Having said that, I think that it's very important for anyone who wants to win power and be successful to try to build a bigger tent, to try to transcend this us versus them mentality. So even if, and I'm not making any statements about the right wing in Australia, I don't know anything about them. They may be, I have no, I'm interested in good governance. I'm not interested in ideology. But any party, far left or far right, that tries to divide us in order to rule us is a danger. And so, and I don't think ultimately will be successful. Maybe temporarily Pol Pot holds power, but ultimately Pol Pot fails. And, maybe temporarily Mussolini holds power, but ultimately Mussolini or Stalin fails. So, like the dictators we began at the beginning. And so I think that really the only wise and sustainably long-term path to political power and rule is a kind of big tent strategy. Maybe I'm just an optimist.
Well, I think you're a rational optimist, and it's been such a pleasure and a privilege speaking with you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Before you go, could I ask a quick favour? If you haven't rated or reviewed the podcast on iTunes, could you please do so? I know everyone asks, but it helps. It really does. Making these podcast episodes is bloody time consuming, but they're important and I couldn't do them without you. Also, if you want to keep getting episodes as they come out, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. That's all. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you. Until next time, ciao.